This is my video about the problem with baby Pokemon. So for those who are new here, what is a baby Pokemon exactly? In the card game, the baby Pokemon are usually depicted a little something like this, like Pichu, like Cleffa, like Budew, and they all share a lot of similarities. They all are basic Pokemon that have 30 HP. They all have an attack that doesn't have a cost to use, and they all also have no retreat cost, meaning that you can return them to your bench at no cost to yourself. And if you're at all familiar with the card game compared to the video game, you'll see that these cards are super duper powerful compared to the power of these babies in the video games. In the games, Cleffa, for example, evolves into Clefairy, which evolves into Clefable, and Budew evolves into Roselia, which evolves into Roserade, meaning that these are just weaker versions of the already evolved versions of weak Pokemon. The weakest form of Pokemon you can have, a baby Pokemon. However, this caused a really interesting issue when you wanted to translate these baby Pokemon from the video game into the card game. And that issue is that the baby Pokemon were all made after the initial basic Pokemon, which they came from, was already introduced into the game. This made it so that way there were already cards like Clefairy, which were basic Pokemon that you could play in your deck before Cleffa was even conceived of. This means that if you already had a basic Clefairy, what type of Pokemon were you supposed to make Cleffa? And this was the big problem for Nintendo. How are you supposed to add babies to the game? They come up with a few solutions as to how to implement babies into the Pokemontcg. The first one of these is the Baby Evolution Pokepower that we see here on Budew, which allows you to evolve Budew into Roselia, even though Roselia is already a basic Pokemon. This alone doesn't serve much of a purpose, so they also had to give you a reason to evolve Budew into Roselia in the card itself. If we look at Roselia here, you can see that its attack gets stronger if you have evolved it from Budew. This effect of the stronger attack if you evolve from Budew is also continued with the Roserade card, which also does additional damage if you have Budew underneath it. However, the Pokemon Company didn't end up sticking with this strategy, as this strategy is not only very clunky, but also gives you a lot of setup requirements for what is relatively hamstringed as a payoff. Not only does adding Budew mean that you have to power up for an additional turn of evolutions to get to your most powerful Pokemon, but it also leads to the problem where if the Pokemon is strong enough without the ability of the Budew card, you would just simply play the cards without Budew, rendering the Pokemon effectively worthless in the card game. However, making a baby Pokemon stand alone comes with a lot of caveats because it's a baby Pokemon, meaning you can't just make it as powerful as you would like. If we take a look at Budew here, we can see that it's a weak baby, meaning that it has to have a very low HP stat, it has to have a very low damage stat, and it has to have an extremely low cost, making it very, very hard to make many versions of a card that do different things that are also babies. In order to make a card like this completely stand alone, the Pokemon Company effectively had to make its ability super duper overpowered to make it see any play in the standard card game. Funnily enough, they also had to make a card like Budew strong enough to see play with monsters such as Arceus, Dialga, and Palga GX in the format. Because both of these cards are basic Pokemon that don't evolve, they fill an effectively similar slot in your deck as a basic standalone Pokemon, meaning that these cards both have to be similar in power level, despite one being literally a baby and one being multiple gods on a single card. The Pokemon Company trying to make both of these cards playable is an interesting task and definitely very weird to look at from a game design perspective. All of these caveats has ended up making the babies some of the best setup cards that the game has ever seen. All the way back in the day with a card like Cleffa, it is extremely hard to remove because of its baby Pokemon ability, making it harder to attack, forcing your opponent to flip a coin every time they attack it, otherwise it doesn't work, but also gives you strong setup as you can draw 7 cards off of its Eek attack. A card like Pichu has a very, very strong setup ability, allowing you to get as many basic Pokemon as you like from your deck and put it onto your bench, effectively setting up your board completely in one turn. Not to mention that Pichu also has a self-saving ability in its Sweet Sleeping Face, which makes it so that way when it is attacked while being asleep, which its attack automatically does, it takes no damage, making it both hard to knock out Pichu and easy for you to set up with Pichu. And if you're familiar with the standard endgame right now, this Cleffa card with a similar grasping draw attack as Eek attack of Cleffa of old gives you a very strong ability to draw cards, even strong for what is a standard supporter card. Not to mention that you can use supporter cards and Cleffa on the same turn, doubling up on massive draw on early turns in the game. And here's where we come to Budew, because Budew is the first one of these baby Pokemons to have a disrupting effect on the game. Budew's itchy pollen attack, disabling item cards from your opponent, is not present on any supporter cards, making it very, very hard to get access to in a regular game of Pokemon. If we look at similar standard legal cards which disable item cards, you can see that they all have a larger cost than what Budew has to stop your opponent from being able to use item cards. Shuppet here, for example, is both a basic Pokemon and turns off your opponent's item cards. However, it requires a coin flip to stop your opponent from being able to use the items, meaning it only works half of the time. And if we look at Banette EX here, the evolved form of Shuppet, not only is it an evolved Pokemon, meaning it takes an extra turn to get into play, requiring a Psychic Energy and only dealing 30 damage with its Everlasting Darkness attack, it generally needs an entire deck built around Banette EX to make it a functional win con, as Banette EX is a very powerful attacker that requires much more setup to actually be able to take out your opponent's Pokemon and not kind of just flounder around while your opponent sets up inside of the lock. These effects typically need to be kept very hamstring because items are really the lifeblood of the game and what keeps Pokemon interesting as a game to play. Cards like Ultra Ball, Rare Candy, and Buddy Buddy Poffin are all super present in many decks, staples of the card game that you're going to see in and out of game in both your deck and your opponent's deck. Almost every deck requires some of these cards in the early game to function as a deck without being extremely lucky as to simply draw into all the pieces they need. The search effects or skipping the evolution phase of Rare Candy is simply mandatory for a lot of decks to be able to set up on the early turns. And this is why people are complaining about Budew being such a problem. If we look at Budew, because it is a baby Pokemon, it has effectively no cost in deck building. Being a basic Pokemon with no energy requirements means you can slot it into literally any deck with almost no cost except for including one copy of Budew in your deck. This makes it an extremely easy splash in many popular metagame decks that not only is a powerful way to start off your game, but can also give you a lead at the beginning of the game with virtually no counterplay from your opponent, as Budew is so cheap to include into your list of 60 cards. In this way, Budew ends up being quite the menace, effectively giving you free turns extra that your opponent can't take advantage of because you happen to have a start with Budew in it, meaning that you can start the game many turns ahead of setup of your opponent that requires you to wait until Budew has been retreated out for your real attacker to start laying into them. There are many decks in the Pokemon trading card game that will simply lose to an early game Budew into a large attacker with really no way of setting up outside of the Budew, and once your opponent is set up, it is far too late for you to be able to catch up. And whilst the design of Budew may be a little bit toxic, it is really interesting to see the way that Pokemon Company has dealt with these baby Pokemon from game to game, going from the video game to the card game. With the examples I've shown you, it's pretty obvious that babies have been strong for a long time in the Pokemon card game, starting all the way back in the day with the original baby Pokemon in Cleffa being one of the most powerful cards ever introduced to the game, allowing you to draw 7 cards with an attack, an unheard of effect at that point, to the Budew of nowadays, which is completely disrupting your opponent and is the only Pokemon to be able to do that at such a low cost. At least myself, I am really interested to see is what is going to come next for these baby Pokemon, as they certainly seem like a minefield for design and seem like a really interesting issue to try to tackle if you were given the Pokemon Company's restriction of making a basic baby Pokemon that cannot evolve. This difficult design issue has been around for the 25 years of Pokemon's life and hasn't really had a good solution introduced since that point. It's been a really long and winding path through all of the years of Pokemon card game design, and it's really interesting to see that they still haven't been able to come up with an interesting way to introduce baby Pokemon into the game, even after all this time. I also think it's pretty cool that these babies have a home here, as in the mainline games, they are generally considered completely useless. So seeing the babies here, having home in powerful decks amongst titans of the game, really gives me a warm heart in seeing that these baby Pokemon have a home. Do you guys in the comments maybe have a better idea for how to implement baby Pokemon into the card game? Let me know down in the comments below any way that you think you could introduce these baby Pokemon into the game in a way that is both balanced and interesting from an evolution standpoint. While you're leaving a comment down below, make sure you like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one or about other card game topics while you're here. Thanks all for watching my video. I'll see you in the next one.